The honourable member for Victoria.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to Bill C-58, the Access to Information Reform legislation, and I say at the outset with considerable disappointment that I must be, on behalf of the NDP, opposed to this initiative. I'm also, however, pleased to hear the President of the Treasury Board acknowledge that at committee there might be a possibility to improve this legislation to give it some credibility. If I may be permitted at the outset to make a personal statement, access to information, freedom of information has been one of my passions. I did graduate work on this topic in law. I worked with the government of British Columbia in drafting the legislation there as well as in the Yukon. I worked back in the early 80s on behalf of the Canadian Bar Association to try to get the first Access to Information Act through in a credible way, and former Member of Parliament for Peace River, Conservative member Jed Baldwin, actually gave me an award of merit from the House for my work on freedom of information. So I come to this with a passion for the topic, Mr. Speaker. Three things are necessary for any credible law. And after 34 years, we all agree this law needs modernizing, and I salute the government for finally doing something in that regard. First, it has to have a clear statement that information is a right, and secondly, that there have to be exceptions to the rule of openness that are narrow and have to demonstrate some harm from the disclosure. And thirdly, there has to be an umpire, some neutral, who can order the government that doesn't wish to provide the information to make it public. Those are the three things by which any reform must be evaluated. And sadly, this bill comes up short. Now, people sometimes have their eyes glaze over when we talk about access to information. That's usually the end of a conversation. People go back to doing something else. But I want to say to Canadians who may be watching this, why this is important. How many times have you read an article that starts with information released today under the Access to Information Act reported thus and so? Well, the answer, Mr. Speaker, is frequently. The Globe and Mail used the Access to Information Act for its April 2016 investigative series Unfounded that revealed that the police had been dismissing 1 out of every 5 sexual assault claims as baseless. It took a year to get the information. The delays are ridiculous, and I'll come back to that. But that was the tool that was necessary for Canadians to understand what their police were and weren't doing about sexual assault. Just last week, the CBC reported that the Prime Minister's controversial Bahamas vacation cost Canadians over $215,000, far more than was initially disclosed to Parliament. That came about through a document released under this Act. And just yesterday morning, I woke up to hear that after a year, reporters finally obtained the original contract for the Phoenix pay fiasco, once again thanks to this Act. So transparency is important. It was a major theme for the Liberal Party during the 2015 election. And in fact, before that, the Prime Minister introduced Bill C-613, an act to amend the Access to Information Act. I would invite, Mr. Speaker, all Canadians to look at what the Prime Minister did in that bill, or wanted to do while in opposition, to what was actually done today. I think you'll see a yawning divide. What he said, though, in doing that, in introducing that legislation was, I quote, "A country's access to information system is at the heart of open government." He's right. Our Supreme Court also said that what we're talking about today is, in fact, quasi-constitutional in nature. This isn't an ordinary bill. It's something that courts have recognized as essential to an open, modern democracy. The New Democratic Party has introduced private members' bills to modernize this Act. So many times I don't want to list them all, but you can check in 2006, 2008, 2011, 2014. This is something that we've tried to fix as well. Every time the Conservatives and then the Liberals voted them down. Now, in March of 2015, the Information Commissioner released 85 recommendations to modernize the Act. I would invite Canadians to look at that list of recommendations and what we're left with today. So, Mr. Speaker, the point is this is essential to fix. As the President of the Treasury Board properly pointed out, back when we introduced this bill in the early 80s, computers were hardly a fact of life. Email didn't really exist in the public service. Record keeping was very different than it is today. So clearly this is long overdue. It's just too bad that the government hasn't taken the opportunity to do the job properly. Almost all civil society groups that have studied this have been outspoken in their opposition. Some angry, but most simply sad and disappointed that this is what we're left with. Let me tell you about what they didn't do, because that's how you really have to assess this exercise. The exemptions to this act, to the rule of disclosure, the list of things the government can properly withhold are very badly drafted, very discretionary, don't even have to show a harm, but there's one that is different than all the others. Because back when this bill was introduced under the former Prime Minister Trudeau regime, they decided to cut out a category of records called, are you ready? Cabinet confidences. It doesn't even apply to cabinet confidences. And everybody who's ever studied this has said this is the Mack truck clause. In fact, some of my, more humorous of the commentary describes this as cabinet laundering. Because all you have to do, Mr. Speaker, if you don't want something disclosed, is slip it into a cabinet briefing book, voila, the black hole. It never gets to be seen. It isn't even subject to the Act. So you would have thought that after 34 years, job one would have been to maybe talk about that. Not even mentioned. The black hole remains. Cabinet laundry can continue. Information delayed is information denied. Every journalist in the land understands that. I had one stop me on the street the other day, and she said, you know, when I get asking for information, I usually get it at the very last, say there's a 30-day period. Day 29, I'm told I'm going to ask for a delay, and then they ask for another delay. And if she complains to the Information Commissioner, well, that office is swamped. It might take several months to get the story out. And even then, if the government doesn't want to do what the Information Commissioner recommends, they can say no. So, Mr. Speaker, information delayed is information denied. That won't be fixed by this bill in any meaningful way. The other thing is we live in an oral culture. In fact, one of my colleagues refers to it as the post-it culture. Let me explain. If you want to have a record that you know is going to be subject to the Act and disclosed, maybe you put a little post-it note on the document that says what the real juicy bits are. That happens, Mr. Speaker. I know you'll be surprised to know that. The duty to document decisions isn't even part of this Act. I talked earlier about computers where we can delete transitory records and the like, but the fact is an oral culture is alive and well and living in Ottawa. So let me get to the bill. What does C-58 do, and why can we not support it? Well, I'd first like to quote from the Centre for Law and Democracy, and it goes like this. The bill is far more conspicuous for what it fails to do. It fails to expand the scope of the Act. It does place a number of proactive publication obligations on some actors like the Prime Minister's office and other ministers' offices. That's true. But it fails, the Centre concludes, it falls far short of bringing these bodies within the ambit of the Act. So certain types of information that's always been available, at least in recent years, you know, travel expenses, contracts over $10,000, by policy, these have been available for years. Now they put it in the Act and think they should get a gold star for doing that. Well, I'm not sure why. Again, quoting from the Centre for Law and Democracy, quote, while more proactive disclosure is always welcome, as anyone who is used to the Act knows, it is absolutely not a substitute for the right to be able to request the information one is interested in from public authorities. So that, I think, is clear. Now, Mr. Speaker, the minister today made a lot of the notion that there is to be order-making powers under this bill. Well, it's true. If you kind of look closely, you'll see that it is, in the words of a colleague, a chimera. It doesn't really do that. Let me tell you how it works in the provinces. Let's take British Columbia, for example. The Information Commissioner makes an order. Disclose that record, government. I know you don't want to do it, but it's not able to be withheld legitimately under the exceptions. And that's it. If the government wants to seek judicial review of that decision, it does so. Compare that to the convoluted order-making power that the minister was so proud of in this bill. It seems to say that if the government agrees with the decision of the commissioner to release the document, it'll be released. Well, so what? If the government disagrees with the commissioner's recommendation, then it can take her to federal court. Imagine how expensive and litigious this is all going to be. And so the government has created, in my submission, an unwieldy, unnecessary, and unaffordable system. I wish I had time to go into the section that deals with this, but it talks of the ability to make an order, but it is, in the interest of time, suffice it to say, beyond complicated and likely unworkable. So it doesn't really do as what the minister has said it will do. I wish they had followed the simple route that most provinces have followed. Though there will be, it's true, proactive disclosure of a bunch of kinds of information from ministers' offices, but the point is Canadians will still not be able to request the information they want from those officers, appeal to the commissioner, and get an order to release it. It's just not there. So the promise made in the election that we would have open offices and you get the information, this is not what is happening, and that is very disappointing. They also talked about the 5-year review that is a feature of this act, and thank goodness it's there. And that's nothing new. But it's not like the Bank Act, for example, where the legislation will sunset if that review doesn't take place by that time. So who knows how long it'll actually take before we get to the review that's promised. It's very different than what the platform promised. They talked today as well about something new, which is the ability to go after bad faith, long, frivolous and vexatious requests. And that's a new restriction, not a change for the positive. And I can appreciate why it's necessary. And yes, it's existing in the provincial level. But here's the punchline. This bill would give the final decision to the government to decide whether it's too big, too long, frivolous. Everywhere else, of course, it's the commissioner that gets to decide. Remember what I said, Mr. Speaker, about an umpire in the game who's neutral? Kind of don't think the minister who doesn't want the information to be disclosed is in best position to do that. I can't believe they think that's a significant reform that we should be proud of. So, Mr. Speaker, the government is probably going to pat itself on the back for this bill. It's probably going to say, yeah, we promised openness and transparency and openness by default, and that's what we delivered. The truth is far from that. Now, I want to be optimistic. I always try to be and give the government the benefit of the doubt. The minister stood in this place and said, we will be open to amendments at committee, and we're sure going to be there to try to give him the opportunity to make this credible, because it is not credible now. It's kind of like the promise when they said they were going to have the last election in 2015. Remember, it was something about the last election that would be fought under the first past the post rules. Well, that was kind of a different promise. That was a different time and place. The Prime Minister came to my riding when he was running and said he would have a full review of the Kinder Morgan pipeline proposal. Remember that promise? That kind of didn't happen either. There was one about mail delivery that was going to be the last, we're going to be open to mail delivery, I think. That was another promise. This bill Canadians deserve better than this bill. It's a start to the extent that it frankly adds exemptions. It doesn't go after the big changes and exemptions. You heard me talk about cabinet confidences. Let me tell you the other nice one, which is the policy advice to the minister. They didn't touch it. But all you got to do is put all these documents in something that you give to the minister, and that's policy advice to the government, and that massive loophole remains. Once again, Mr. Speaker, it's what they didn't do is how you judge their reform initiative. It actually adds a loophole which allows the department to refuse to process a request if they deem it to be overly broad, they deem it would unreasonably interfere with the operations of government, or deem it to be made in bad faith. It's quite remarkable, Mr. Speaker, that that they're patting themselves on the back. Again, by simple comparison to the other legislation in the country, it would be obvious that this bill doesn't pass muster. The bill also ignores so many of the recommendations made by the Information Commissioner, as I pointed out, and by the Ethics Committee that also studied this legislation. It appears the government didn't even read those. Much like the Harper government, the Liberals continue to disregard the recommendations made by the nonpartisan watchdog. One sympathizes with the Herculean efforts made by Ms. Legault over the years to try to get all governments, both sides of this place, conservative and liberal alike, to take the citizens' right to know seriously. I salute her for her efforts, futile though they have been to date. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say, by way of conclusion, that the New Democrats have long advocated for giving the Information Commissioner real oversight and review powers, order-making powers. We believe that proactive disclosure is important, and congratulations for putting in legislation what has been the practice to date so far. But I point out the Commissioner doesn't have oversight powers with respect to that proactive disclosure, so I guess we have to take the government's word for it. And even if the Liberals were well-intentioned, remember, we're making legislation that applies for future Canadians, for future generations of Canadians. How long did it take to get to this place with a new bill? 34 years. So, Mr. Speaker, we have to get it right. We can't say, oh, don't worry, we're going to have a review in 5 years. Well, maybe another year or two after that, because they don't have to do that if they don't want to. That's been our history, except in the Bank Act. So I have to say, we have to do it better. We can do it better. It's not just me saying this. The Centre for Law and Democracy, which has been cited already, has made the same point. Democracy Watch has explained it. Mark Weiler, the Web and User Experience librarian who testified before, and he wrote to our critic on this file, the honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, and he stated as follows, Mr. Weiler, Professor Weiler, I'm greatly concerned that Bill C-58 will actually diminish the capacity of Canadians to access unpublished materials held by the government. The Access to Information Act should enhance the ability of Canadians to access information the government chooses not to publish. Bill C-58 would actually make the Access to Information Act more difficult to use. So, Mr. Speaker, what are we going to do about this? Back to the basics. There has to be a strong statement of the right to know, and there is some verbiage to that effect in the new law. The exemptions have to be narrow, and they have to be about injury, not just you're in a box, a particular category of records like policy advice or the like. You have to show that that would harm some government interest. They didn't do that. They didn't touch any of them. They only added one. And the third thing is there has to be real order-making power when the umpire says the government has got it wrong. That didn't cause a revolution in British Columbia when we did it. And that order-making power actually led to something like 90% of cases being mediated without the need to have a formal order-making hearing. And very, very, very rarely do we go to court. Statistically insignificant. There's ample precedence for doing this right. The order-making power that's in here is beyond comprehension. It'll be expensive. It's totally unnecessary. Why do we have to make it so complicated when the principle is so obvious and for which there's so many examples across the land? Mr. Speaker, I want to end on a positive note. We hope the government was serious when the member stood in this House, the President of the Treasury Board, earlier today, talked about the need to modernize this law and said that this is only the first phase and this is only a work in progress. He said he welcomes reports at committee, including amendments. Trust me, Mr. Speaker, we will have many of those amendments. We can do better. We must do better for Canadians.